Welcome to Long Live Alternative Parties podcast. Today, friends, we're going to talk about a topic we love to talk about here, election reform. And we have another exciting guest on our podcast today who's going to tell us about his expertise in this matter. His name is Professor Jack Santucci, and he's going to talk to us about election reform and multi-party democracy. So welcome to the podcast, Professor Santucci.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
We are glad to have you. If you could get started by you kindly giving us an introduction to yourself, a brief biographical sketch.
Sure. I'm a professorial lecturer at the George Washington University, where I teach courses in public opinion, American populism, and state and urban politics. I also teach public opinion in the fall semester at New York University's DC program. And in addition to that, I am an adjunct fellow with the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, where I'm basically doing policy writing on electoral reform in big cities.
Oh my, that's up our alley. So we're glad we have you on the podcast today. So could you please tell us about your general research interests?
Yeah, my basic interests when I started doing that work were how to get how to get a more functional political system in the United States. And I'm going back to 2012, 2013, when we're sort of hitting peak polarization and there's a lot of policy gridlock. So, in that sense, I was a lot like a lot of young people. It's like, how do we open up this political system? And that led me to do a project on why electoral reform happens in the first place, and in particular, why the kinds of reforms we associate with multi-party democracy in other countries historically had not been stable in the United States. But more broadly, I'm interested in political institutions and public opinion and how these things fit together. Because if you're going to change your political institutions, you want to understand what's going on in people's heads. You want to understand the preferences you're going to be running through those institutions. And even more broadly than that, just helping to bridge some conceptual divides between the fields of American and comparative politics when it comes to these issues.
Great. That's up our alley. So can you please define election reform for us?
Well, election reform can mean a lot of things. Most of my colleagues in American politics often understand it to mean changes to rules dealing with voter registration, primary openness or closure, mail-in balloting and things like that. For the project we were going to discuss today, I had been more narrowly focused on electoral system reform. And I define an electoral system as a set, or dare I say, system of rules for capturing voters' preferences and turning that information into a set of winners.
Okay, great. So on this podcast, we've talked about a number of election reforms ranging from ranked choice voting to term limits to redistricting, among many others. So can you please tell us what you think would be the most impactful election reform?
Well, impactful with respect to what?
As that would, to our audience, because our audience is interested in alternative parties. So what election reform do you think would be the best election reform that would give the most advantage to alternative parties?
My take on this is maybe a little bit iconoclastic, but not unreasonable. I think there's a myth that the United States has this rigid two-party system, and you simply can't have multi-party democracy before changing the rules that purportedly prop up that two-party system. I'm not sure I agree with that characterization. I think that there's historically been quite a bit of multi-party voting. I mean, you're seeing elections now in the United States where there's a fair amount of multi-party voting. Arguably, what's gone on in New York City is that a minor party has chosen to contest a major party's primary, and then it went off and won that primary. So, I think the idea that we have to put reform before multi-party politics is not one that I subscribe to. Beyond that, though, I think getting to the core of your question, the big thing on my mind right now is, let's say we're going to start experimenting with multi-party democracy. New York City is very much on my mind here, but so is Portland, Oregon to an extent, which I'm sure you know now has PR via the single transferable vote. Let's say that, we have potentially incipient multi-party democracy, and we've already got one of these interesting reforms in place like RCD or PR or whatever. How do we get parties, politicians, and players to compromise with each other and govern so that the reforms themselves don't get blamed for governance failures? That may be a mouthful, but that's kind of where my head is on this question.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. I haven't heard it quite put that way before. So that's good that no matter how many guests we have on this podcast, the guests we have always contribute something new. So that's great.
Thanks.
So, yeah, so that's interesting. That does happen where people do blame the election reform. Sometimes it happens, we hear about when people lose elections, like, for example, in Alaska, one of our podcast guests was talking about how Sarah Palin was blaming ranked choice voting because she lost the election.
Yeah.
Is that what you're getting at, or are you getting at something different about how election reforms can't be blamed for getting in the way?
I think it's important to recognize that if you've got a new reform in place somewhere and something sort of upsetting or detrimental to some interest happens when that reform is in place, people are going to be inclined to blame the reform, which is if we end up discussing the book, that, I can get into more examples of how that works.
Oh, yes. Yes, the next question on my list was about your book about multi-party thing, and that's something that's very interesting to me right now. I'm comparing the multi-party in America versus other countries, and in a lot of ways America is better than other countries from my perspective. We got one of the best constitutions ever, probably the best constitutions. As in regards to multi-party democracy representation, a lot of these other countries that would otherwise be lower than us in a lot of things, they have better multi-party democracy than we do. So that's what I perceive things differently. So can you please tell me about your book?
Yeah. So when I'm writing this book in like 2019, 2020, I think I started writing an active first draft in 2018. The overarching so the book is about the adoption and repeal of the single transferable vote in American cities, and those are the only venues in which a defensibly proportional electoral system had ever been tried in the United States. So these things start getting adopted in 1915 in Ohio, and all in all, there are 22 cases for binding municipal elections, 26 cases if you include advisory councils in federally administered places like Oak Ridge, Tennessee, or what used to be known as single tax colonies. And then by 1961 really, this reform is repealed in all but, of the 22 cases for binding municipal elections, all but one of them. So that was the big research question. How did this, why did this institution get repealed? And that question was interesting from a theoretical perspective, because conventional wisdom is that once a country adopts a PR system, it doesn't turn back. It doesn't repeal a PR system. In other words, if you adopt a PR system, you fragment your party system, and you create a bunch of parties with an interest in preserving PR. So from that perspective, the American trajectory was counterintuitive. And that's what I set out to explain. Why did this get repealed? And in the process of doing that, I had to come up with an answer to the question of why it got adopted in the first place. And then, of course, you're led to ask what's going on in between adoption and repeal. So that's, empirically what the book does. That's the question it grappled with. But at the time that I wrote it, my argument was this trajectory was a consequence of the fact that reformers in the United States were trying to use reform to create a multi-party system, whereas most proportional systems, or even alternative vote, call them ranked choice if you want, systems in other countries, had been adopted to manage and channel already existing multi-party competition.
Oh, interesting.
So when you do that, right, when the reform itself becomes about managing party competition, the reform takes on a whole bunch of characteristics associated with party politics. A very concrete example of this would be, in Australia, under the single transferable vote for Senate elections, voters have the option to vote a free ranking, basically a party slate. You don't see it that way. It doesn't happen that way in the United States. It has very anti-party character to it. So it comes with nonpartisan elections. It comes with other reforms that are designed to organizationally damage party organizations and things like that. I think that's enough about the book.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Does all that make any sense? I mean, I just did a lot of talking.
Yes, yeah. It's like you said, it's counterintuitive. Because oftentimes that's what we in this movement, we want a multi-party democracy. So we think of ranked choice voting as a way to get that done, because people often complain about the spoiler effect. And then we say if we have ranked choice voting in there, then people are going to vote for alternative parties more. And it sounds like also you're focusing on the local levels. And it seems like you're arguing that there's a limited amount of this already happening in the local levels. Oftentimes we're focusing on the national level.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of people, when they are reforming local level elections, many of them have national level elections in mind, right? So for some portion of the people who get involved in local level electoral reform, it's about a broader project of creating multi-party democracy at the national level. But, I wouldn't feel bad for you said that, your argument is counterintuitive. Most people, and I include political scientists when I say this, are schooled in the idea that Duverger's law is the reason we have a two-party system, and the way to get out of this trap is to adopt reforms that relieve us of the so-called spoiler effect. And that mythology has a very old tradition in the Anglo settler democracies. So, the United States, the United Kingdom. And I think that's because these countries have older traditions of what I would call party or cabinet government than countries, say, on the European continent. So, if you have an old tradition of cabinet government, election reform is going to be about busting up that coalition and making space for something else. Whereas if you have multi-party democracy at the same time that you're trying to sort of develop parliamentary cabinet style government, you might see an incumbent government drawn more toward party list types of proportional representation, not to create multi-party democracy, but to stabilize an unstable situation.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense? I mean, that's kind of high-level stuff. But
yes. Okay. Duverger's law, I'm sure I ran across that before. Can you please summarize that for us?
Yeah, that's the thing that says that plurality voting in a single-seat district gives you a two-party system because voters want to avoid wasting their vote, throwing it away. So they choose between the lesser of two evils. Old idea.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, that's one of the big things we run up against all the time, and we have to explain to people. So that we get into big disputes with people who say you got to vote for Kamala Harris because she's the lesser of two evils, or some people think Trump is the lesser of two evils.
Right.
So it's always, and then we say no, we want to vote for that, and then they blame us, like when Bush beat Gore, people blamed Nader for it, and so they acted like he was a villain. He was responsible for all this. So it's a way to shift blames.
Yes. Yeah. There's an assumption there that had Nader not been on the ballot, that the lion's share of his voters would have chosen Gore instead. Right. And that's a potentially testable claim, and there's research on that. And there's other research out there that suggests that might not be how it works. That if you have additional parties on the ballot, that those parties mobilize people to vote who would not otherwise vote.
Yes, exactly. I have never voted for one of the two parties in my entire election career, and I'm 47 right now, and you start voting when you're 18, so that's 30 years. So no, neither people like me who's going to pull in there that I would have not voted for Gore no matter what. So yes, that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean that's one kind of third party voter.
Yep. Yeah, there are other people who vote between the two other parties, and sometimes they vote alternative party, and sometimes it depends on the situation, how close the election is. Sometimes it depends who the candidates are. So yes, there's a lot of different types of alternative party voters.
Yes,
so
there are.
You mentioned Dubois. What other theorists and theories did you come across in your research?
Well, the big body of theory I was drawing on was a perspective on party systems that takes control of government as central. So for many reformers, the question is, how can I elect the candidate I like most in the district where I live? And that perspective can lead to support for any number of reforms that either are proportional representation or come close enough to proportional representation, or in the case of ranked choice and approval voting, seem like stepping stones to proportional representation. Another way to look at democracy is to say, who controls government, what coalitions have come together to exercise collective control of government? What causes those coalitions to come apart? And that way of thinking about democracy is all over the place. I mean, in American politics, a book called Why Parties by John Aldrich, originally written in 1995, I think is the key statement of that perspective. But there are other examples out there. Gary Cox in 1997 wrote a book called Making Votes Count, Strategic Coordination in the World's Electoral Systems. And there, the key prediction is that the number of candidates in any given district should be the number of seats in the district, call that M, plus one. And so people will walk away from that book and say, that's the generalized Duverger rule, M plus one. But Cox's broader point is that competition for the top offices in a nation have all kinds of other effects on the party system going down, and have all kinds of effects on how parties behave under electoral systems at the district level. All that to say that control of government is really when I sit down and think about why electoral reform does or does not happen, I think about the players as though they care about control of government, rather than thinking about players as though they care about getting the candidate they like most in the district where they live.
Okay, so the difference is the specific candidate that they want versus control of government in general.
Yeah, I mean, you could think of one way to think about this is that we all have to live under the government that gets elected and takes power.
Yes.
So what are people thinking about, when they do electoral reform? And some people are thinking about representation. Some people are thinking about having a candidate they like win the seat. Other people are thinking about what coalition is going to control government and make policy. And I found that perspective was more useful for explaining, for accounting for why these reforms got adopted and then repealed.
Oh, okay. So some people want to abolish political parties. They sometimes say George Washington, and we did have somebody on the podcast before here a long time ago now that we should get rid of political parties. So do you think making things nonpartisan would be a better way to go, or do you think that's not going to get to the root of the problem?
Well, you can't really abolish political parties, and even some of the fiercest advocates of nonpartisan elections will come out and just admit that. Like, these parties aren't going anywhere. We just want to make life a little bit harder for them. The big question, I think, in political science is whether such efforts ultimately make the overall situation worse for the everyday voter. Someone who says yes, that efforts to make elections nonpartisan are hard on everyday voters, might point to things like, lower turnout in elections where ballots don't include party labels. Well, why would that be? It's because when voters get to the part of the ballot where the office is nonpartisan, they don't know whom to choose because they don't have the party cue there, so they just abstain. Arguments like that are some of the common arguments in favor of nonpartisan elections. I mean, my view, in the context of electoral system reform, is that if you want to use things like cumulative voting, ranked choice voting, single transferable vote, you're better off, the nonpartisanship of those, combining those systems with nonpartisan ballots probably makes those systems even more likely to get repealed because it introduces a lot more uncertainty into how people are going to be using the ballot.
Okay. That makes sense from our perspective. We've talked about in this podcast before whether candidates should run as independents or as alternative parties, and some people say the various reasons for those both. And one reason people give in favor of alternative parties is because when you have the party label on there, you have some degree of knowledge about what the party stands for. Now, of course, it's not perfect because there's variation within each party. Yet if somebody's a Green Party, they're probably not going to be like a Republican. They might be socialist, or they might be a Democratic socialist.
Yep.
You might not know 100%, yet you're going to know there's a certain, it's a boundary you're drawing by putting that party label on there, so you know where they're not, depending on the party. So, yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that.
Yeah, interesting. That's an interesting way to put it. You know where the candidate is not. Not less so maybe where they are, but you know where they are not. Interesting.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the UK was similar in some ways to the United States with the political systems, although we have our differences. Would you say the UK would be a model for the United States to move towards election reform, or are there other countries that are better examples yet for us?
Well, at the national level, there's not. I mean, there's periodically been buzz about election reform, electoral reform, in the sense we've been talking about it for 150 years, not more than that. But it just doesn't happen. The interesting thing about the United Kingdom is that despite its quote-unquote first past the post elections, which should make Duverger's law operative, it now has multi-party democracy, as everybody can see by opening up the news. So I'm not sure there's a lot to emulate. Not that the system is bad or good in any sense. There's just not much going on at the national level that one could emulate. That said, there were in the 1990s and early 2000s a series of electoral reforms in the devolved nations of the United Kingdom. Several of which brought about systems of proportional representation. And I think some of that some of that activity could be worth learning more about and, understanding why it happened. And in particular, understanding why, say, in Scotland, they chose to do mixed member proportional rather than the single transferable vote, right? And that was big because the single transferable vote, ranked choice voting, had long been the core goal of the British Electoral Reform Society. So all of that is interesting and worth learning more about, and probably has something to teach us about what could happen at the state level in the United States.
Oh, at the state level, because the other countries are smaller than us usually, so their national system would correspond to a state system of ours?
Well, just that Wales is to the United Kingdom as, say, Ohio is to the United States. Scotland is to the United Kingdom as Florida is to the United States. But your point about the size of the country also matters. So, that's the other thing that makes, when I wrote the book, my argument, the United States is different because we never spawned a socialist party. Yes, we had various little factions of socialists, running around for a while, but, we never spawned a sort of a mass-based, disciplined socialist party. It could command votes and create big problems for other parties in the system. And that's what gets stable PR in other countries. And its absence in the United States is why we have this good government, anti-party, anti-corruption activity going on that ultimately is unstable. All right, so that's the argument as of 2019, 2020, 2021. I think an underappreciated consideration in that argument was the size of the United States. This is geographically and population-wise an extremely large country, and perhaps it is more useful to think of the Democratic and Republican parties as big coalitions that exist primarily to navigate a constitution designed to frustrate majority rule.
Oh.
To put a sharper point on it, the America's two parties are coalitions of factions.
Oh.
And in smaller countries, or perhaps in countries with different kinds of constitutions, factions are more likely to find expressions as parties in their own right. I mean, that's a possibility that I've written about a bit elsewhere outside of the book.
Oh my! So these parties seem like they're bigger, not necessarily in the sense of more members, but in more attributes. There's more going on there than other parties, where in other nations they would splinter into smaller parties.
And perhaps, I mean, we do see splintering happen here as well. But yeah, I mean, you've got a constitution that makes it. So we come back to this consideration of control of government. It's really hard to get unified control of government in the United States because you can win a majority of votes at a congressional election, but that's probably not going to give you a majority in the Senate, and it might not give you it might not give you control of the White House, especially if we're in a midterm election. So this is the separation of powers, and then of course you've got federalism historically. So the separation of powers and federalism together really frustrate nationwide majority rule. And one reason that the two-party system emerges in the United States is to sort of get around those constraints on majority rule. So I'm thinking about, the Jacksonian period is really when you see the two-party system settle in the United States, begin to really settle in the sense of commanding voters' loyalty and binding their behavior.
Okay, interesting. So, Professor Santucci,
yes,
where
sir.
can our audience get your book that gives you the most royalties?
That's generous of you, Andrew. They can go to Oxford University Press's website. They can look for more parties or no parties, the politics of electoral reform in America. And they can get a discount on the book by entering the code A as in Adam, S as in Sam, ASS as in Fig, L as in Larry, Y as in yes, Q as in Quentin, and 6 as in the number. So ASFLYQ6. That'll shave a few bucks off the cost of the book.
Oh, great, great. So, is there any other ways our audience can support you in your efforts?
Well, my efforts these days really are geared toward understanding what's happening in the party system. We've been through a lot of change over the last 8 to 10 years, and some research I've been working on lately suggests that change is accelerating, and it's not clear what all of that change in the party system means for how electoral reform is going to happen, how it should happen, what it should look like if it does happen, whether we even need it anymore. So I would just encourage people to have an open mind, learn as much as they can about this stuff, and I'll give you an example. I wrote, 2 years ago, I wrote a couple of pieces suggesting the adoption of open list proportional representation for, U.S. House elections. And the argument there is that this might help bring some order and stability to a situation that seemed like it was spiraling out of control at the time. And some of that was received as anti-RCV. It's tough because, as we discussed, a lot of electoral reform activity in the United States is intended to kind of blow up the two-party system. And as a consequence, people sort of decide on what reform they think is best for that. And then it becomes, how do I get the most people to support that reform? And, well, part of getting a lot of people to support the reform I've chosen means defeating these competitor reforms. I'm not sure that's a productive way to look at it. I think we need to constantly be asking ourselves what's going on in the party system, and what reform is most appropriate to making the party system as it is orderly and democratic. Open minds.
Open minds?
Open minds.
That's a good call. That's a good call to arms. So, Professor
Thank you,
Santucci,
Andrew.
no problem. We appreciate your time today. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to enlighten us about this important topic.
I very much appreciate your interest. Thanks for reaching out.
Have yourself a good day and all the best to you and all your endeavors in life.
You too, Andrew. Stay in touch. Bye.